Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Hammer Museum. I'm Claudia Bester. I'm the Director of Public Programs here, and I'm delighted to welcome you to today's talk about the artwork of the great poet, novelist, playwright, politician, and critic, Victor Hugo. Hugo was a preeminent figure in the social, political, and cultural life of France in the 19th century. In addition to being one of the great writers in literary history, he was also an accomplished draftsman, and he produced a lesser-known but remarkable body of works on paper. The Hammer just opened a really fantastic new exhibition called Stones to Stains, The Drawings of Victor Hugo, which sheds new light on Victor Hugo's experimental and enigmatic practice and includes over 75 drawings and photographs he made throughout his career. The exhibition was organized by Hammer Museum curators Cynthia Burlingham and Allegra Pesenti and curatorial assistant Mathieu Vahanian in collaboration with independent scholar Florian Rodari. And we want to thank the Center for European and Russian Studies at UCLA and the Alliance Française for supporting a series of related public programs, including today's talk. Cynthia Burlingham is unable to join us today, but I'm delighted to have an opportunity to introduce my colleague, Allegra Pesenti. She's the Associate Director and Senior Curator at the Grunwald Center at the Hammer Museum. Allegra is from Milan, Italy, and did her undergraduate studies at the École du Louvre in Paris and the University College London, and she received her master's and PhD degrees from the Courtauld Institute of Art in London, where she specialized in the study of Italian drawings of the 15th and 16th century. She began her museum career in the prints and drawings departments of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the British Museum, and the Louvre before joining the drawings department at the Getty Museum in 1999. At the Hammer Museum, she oversees the Grunwald Center's collection of 45,000 prints, drawings, photographs, and artists' books dating from the Renaissance to the present. She curated a number of exhibitions, including Gouge, the Modern Woodcut 1870 to now, Rachel Whiteread Drawings, and Zarina, Paper Like Skin, and was one of the co-organizing curators of Alina Shapozhnikov Sculpture Undone, 1955 to 1972. She also initiated the series of artist-curated and collection-based exhibitions called House Guest. Allegra was hired as the chief curator of the Menil Drawing Institute in Houston in 2013, where she presented her exhibition, which was co-organized with the Hammer Museum, called Apparitions, Frottage and Rubbing from 1860 to Now. She rejoined the Hammer in 2017 as associate director and senior curator of the Grunwald Center for the Graphic Arts, and we're very glad to have her back. So now she's here to tell us the fascinating story not only of Victor Hugo and his extraordinary life, but also the behind-the-scenes tale of the treasure hunt she and Cynthia Burlingham have been on as they located the pieces for this landmark exhibition. So please join me in welcoming Allegra Pesenti.
Thank you, Claudia, and welcome everyone. It's nice to see you here on a Sunday afternoon. As Claudia mentioned, this was going to be a dialogue between Cindy, my colleague, and I, and due to some unforeseen circumstances, I'm really sorry that Cindy is not able to join me today, but as you'll see, she is extremely present in today's monologue, no longer a dialogue, because she is in almost every slide you'll see. So she's very much among us. And I should add before starting that the exhibition was a wonderful collaboration between Cindy and I. I think it was, I could say, in every sense, a complete collaboration. So I will speak for both of us today. Before I start, a few words about the title that we chose, Uncovering Victor Hugo. What exactly did we mean by uncovering? We decided, encouraged by Claudia, I should say, to not give a lecture about the exhibition and about the works in the exhibition today. We felt that we would like to encourage you to see it and to read the works and walk through it with your own opinions. But we chose today to rather lay down the barriers of the show and take you back scene, tell you about the backstories of the exhibition. There's always, or often, there's a sort of misconception about what a curator does. I feel like visitors, including myself, we enter an exhibition and it's a fait accompli. The exhibition is up, everything is sprinkly clean, it tells a story from start to finish. It takes us more or less an hour, depending on how interested we are, maybe more, maybe less. And that hour does not even begin to reveal the years, the many hours, the collaborations, the conversations, the correspondence, the voyages that one exhibition took. So by uncovering today, I'm hoping to really reveal these many voyages, these adventures that a single exhibition took us on. So to start off, why Victor Hugo? Why did Cindy and I choose Victor Hugo? What brought us to him, and why did we think that this was important? Well, as all of you will know, Victor Hugo was a major figure of the 19th century, but he remains so today. He remains as relevant to us today as he was in the 19th century, as a novelist, as we all know him as a novelist, as a political activist, as a lifelong opponent to the death penalty, as a defender of human rights, as an exile. He was almost 20 years an exile on the islands of Jersey and Guernsey. He's depicted here steadfast on a rock known as the Rock of the Exiles on the island of Jersey. This is a photograph taken by his son, Charles Hugos, but very much choreographed by Hugo himself. He encouraged his son to learn the new art of photography, but he was very much behind the sort of mise en scène of these photographs, and this is how he wanted to be seen, steadfast on his rock, as if he were looking back to France, his country of origin and of birth. So why Hugo? Because really he is known as this great figure, but not known as a visual artist. And so we felt that as relevant as he is today, he is not known for one of the practices that he was very proficient in, the art of drawing. Two other slides that sort of reflect the great fame of Victor Hugo in his own time. The slide on the right is a photograph of Victor Hugo's funeral in 1885. Over 2 million people were known to have attended Victor Hugo's funeral. I think that's even more than the population of Paris at the time. He was incredibly popular. And the slide on the left is it looks like his funeral. It wasn't actually. He was actually still alive when this photograph was taken. It's a procession that took place on his, I believe, 78th birthday. So a few years before he died, 500,000 people processed through the streets of Paris and under his windows to honor their great writer, leader, and French national. At that point, he'd come back from exile to his country of birth. So this brings us to why now? Why did Cindy and I decide to do this exhibition right now? Well, it has been 20 years since the first and only other exhibition that took place in America of Victor Hugo's drawings. And that exhibition was held at the Drawing Center in 1998. And it was under the helm of Annie Philbin, our current director at the time. She co-curated this exhibition. And in our discussions, encouraged us to revisit the work. There's it is completely unfortunate that these works are unknown in this country, or very little known outside of France, and have never been shown on our side of the world. And we decided that it was time to revisit these works and to shed light on them. There's also an incredible urgency to show them now. The works are very fragile, incredibly difficult to borrow. It took us over 5 years to secure the loans, and we believe that this will probably be the last time we'll be able to see as many drawings by Victor Hugo in this country, because the loans are so incredibly rare and fragile. The drawings are made of a type of ink that tends to corrode the paper. They're very light sensitive. Because Victor Hugo was so experimental and spontaneous in his approach to drawing, he often cut holes in them, bled pools of water on them, which made the paper incredibly thin. So the loans, we're fortunate to have them today, might not ever have them again in this type of presentation. So there was an urgency to do it now. Why us? Why did we choose the hammer? Why did we feel it was important to do it here? Well, Cindy's and my field of expertise is works on paper. Cindy has worked for many years on mainly prints, but also drawings. I've been working on mainly drawings, but also prints for a long time. And it's also an area that the Hammer Museum is specifically devoted to. And then the Hammer has a practice of bringing the historical art into the contemporary. We've done this before. We have a tradition of doing it, and Cindy and I have a strong inclination to bringing the historical into now. My own expertise is in Renaissance art, but I've been curating exhibitions of contemporary artists all through the medium of paper. So trying to sort of bring down the barriers of time and bring the past into the present and the present into the future. So now onto these barriers that we want to bring down, and let's look a little bit back at the history of exhibitions of drawings of Victor Hugo. Just this is what we started to do when we started our conversation on an exhibition on Victor Hugo. We started to look at what's been done in the past. So apart from this one in America, nothing had been done. This is a very early exhibition of Victor Hugo drawings. Most of the exhibitions that have happened in France. This one was held at the Maison Victor Hugo, which was one of our key and principal lenders. The Maison was started by a man called Paul Meurice, who was Victor Hugo's executor, and he was the proud owner of a substantial trove of drawings of Victor Hugo's, and he decided to have the city of Paris buy the house of Victor Hugo on the Place des Vosges and turn it into a museum devoted to him. And the first exhibitions that were held in the domestic setting of Victor Hugo's apartments. The first exhibition ever held outside of France was held in 1974 at the Victor and Albert Museum. This was actually the last exhibition of his work in England, and it was organized by Pierre Georgel, who is currently writing the catalogue raisonné of drawings of Victor Hugo, and he's still today the sort of grand expert of Victor Hugo drawings. A wondrous and mega galactic exhibition that heralded the centenary of Hugo's death was held in Paris in 1985, called La Gloire de Victor Hugo, and it was held at the Grand Palais in Paris. And this slide only shows you the cover of the catalogue. What it doesn't show you is that the catalogue is about this thick. It's sort of a tome of Victor Hugo. There have been scattered a few exhibitions of his drawings here and there outside of France. This one was held in Spain at the Museo Nacional Thyssen-Bornemisza in 2000. But the main institution that continues to exhibit the work is the Maison de Victor Hugo in Paris that I encourage you to visit. The director there comes up with extraordinary topics. In this one, the entry of the mediums focused on Victor Hugo's interest in spiritism. He actually held sessions with the Ouija board when he was in exile and spoke to the dead. And a lot of the drawings actually are remnants or reflections of this more sort of ethereal side of the artist. So this was an exhibition that was held in 2013. So now to go back to Cindy's and my start, how did we go about this exhibition from here? Well, by looking. The first thing we did and decided to do was really to look and see as much as possible. And of course, the first trip we took was to Paris. And the first of many trips to Paris, I should say. We visited the Louvre. This is the Department of Prints and Drawings, the Cabinet de Dessin at the Louvre. It's interesting, the Louvre has three absolutely fantastic drawings by Victor Hugo, but because these drawings are incredibly fragile, they decided not to lend, unfortunately, but we did spend many hours in their study room. You must forgive us. We decided to show you images of the places, because these are behind the scenes. These European study rooms are part of the reason why both of us actually entered the world of paper, because these study rooms take you outside of the public eye, outside of the galleries, and into this extraordinary realm of intimacy. You see drawings as if reading a book. They are held in those cylinder boxes that are on the table there. And you're allowed to hold the drawings, look at them at a very close distance. And so this sort of act of revelation is really something that brought us very close to well, in this case, the work of Victor Hugo, but that encouraged us from the beginning to start a career in this field, not to mention the grandiosity of the study rooms that we worked in. This is also another view of the study room at the Louvre. I'm so sorry, this was one. Cindy sneaked this slide in of me. This is us looking at an extraordinary drawing, which unfortunately we couldn't borrow, but it's one of his great representation of the planets. Hugo was an amateur astronomer, and while he was in exile, became completely mesmerized by the skies at night. He would take nighttime walks, and I think that it was also a way of sort of forgetting that he was in exile. It was a way of looking at the skies and thinking, well, that's the same sky I could see in France. It's the same sky that we all see. We're all one when we're at night looking at the skies. One place we spent many, many hours was the Bibliothèque Nationale, the National Library in Paris, and the other principal lender to this exhibition. When Victor Hugo, in his will, left his entire archive of manuscripts, photographs, drawings, notes, clippings, you name it, to the French state, to the French National Library. And so we are fortunate to this day to continue to be able to have access to this incredible trove of work. The Bibliothèque Nationale has gone through numerous restorations in the past year that affected our research, actually, because their study room has been closed on and off, but we persevered and waited until we could have access to them. We also persevered because they've had a number of changes of curatorial staff. So we, as our research went on, we continued to converse with the ongoing changes in staff and with the various curators there. This is all part of the research of an exhibition, is befriending your colleagues and making sure that they may one day be kind to you and lend. We were very naughty at the Bibliothèque Nationale. One of their great rules is no photography. And we felt that since we'd come all the way from LA and we needed to remember what we saw, a lot of the work we saw is unpublished. So we sneakily took some photographs, and I hope you won't tell anyone, but we also wanted to share some of these sneaked out photographs just to show you some of the process, but also the whole, as I was saying before, revelation of having these works in front of us. We went through many, many boxes. There are over 3,000 drawings by Hugos survived today, and I would say perhaps half of that are held at the Bibliothèque Nationale. So that takes a lot of visits and many hours of viewing. We also looked through a lot of sketchbooks. And then finally, the other place, I should say that it took us about a year of failed attempts to get into the back scenes of the Maison Victor Hugo. We'd been able to see the museum, but we'd had a lot of difficulties getting in touch with the curator and the director. And in the end, I finally just banged on the door. I turned up one day and I said, I've come all the way from LA, and I insist, I really would like to see some drawings here. And lo and behold, a lovely registrar and curator. I was very lucky, someone who enjoyed speaking Italian. And so I made the most of my language skills and befriended her. And finally, she became one of the key and instrumental people in the exhibition. Claire is really a formidable presence in the exhibition. She finally opened the door and became our correspondent at the Maison. On the right is a view of the Place des Vosges, where the Maison is, and on the left, in the far corner, you see the what was once Victor Hugo's apartment and is now the Maison. A different type of study room, a makeshift study room, because it is in an old apartment. So they've had to make do with an old Parisian home, and so here the display of drawings was a bit more casual, but no less serious. That's on the left. I should introduce Florian Rodari, who I call our man in Paris. He was our collaborator on this exhibition. He also was very involved with the first exhibition that was held in this country at the Drawing Center, and he was with us on many of the visits. And you'll see all of our tools there that we use was for very, very careful examination with loops and cameras and all kinds of paraphernalia. We saw a lot of work that we fell in love with, but that in the end we didn't borrow because they didn't fit within our theme. This is a book that Victor Hugo decorated with a family tree, and he made these collages. He was, as you'll see later on, incredibly crafty collagist and decorator, craftsman. This is Claire, our wonderful colleague, showing one of the pebbles that we exhibit in the exhibition. This is her sort of opening one of in the deep storages of the Maison Victor Hugo, opening one of the many cupboards, where this one happened to have a whole series of the man with a great ego, hundreds of portraits of him and sculpted portraits. This makes me laugh when I look at this. It actually wasn't a very comic, I should say, day, because this is one of Cindy's and my trips happened to coincide with the 2015 terrorist attacks in Paris. And it was on the 5th of November, I believe. And we were getting calls from family and colleagues and friends to get out of Paris, that it was very dangerous. And of course, we knew that and were completely horrified. But at that point, we had made so many appointments with our colleagues in Paris that we felt that sort of leaving them at that point would have been so... it would have... We just didn't feel like that was the right thing to do, because they were ready to receive us. And for them, life went on. And so we wanted to stay steadfast in our plans and to continue working with them. And I remember the day we were at the Maison Victor Hugo, which was really just a few days after the attacks. And one of the terrorists had been found in an area of Paris called Saint-Denis. And I remember telling my father, the only place I won't go in Paris, don't worry, is Saint-Denis. I'll stay away from that area of Paris and I'll stay safe. And to this day, I remember being at the Maison Victor Hugo and the director telling us that we had to head off to the storage, because most of the drawings that we wanted to see were held in storage in the north of Paris, in the area of Saint-Denis. So lo and behold, off we were on the metro, going to the very area where I had sworn that we wouldn't go. One of the terrorist attacks was actually in Saint-Denis as well. So this is us on this doomed day, Cindy and I in Saint-Denis, gangsters walking down. And finally, we reached Chenu, the area and the storage area, which actually took us out of our misery. And again, a moment of complete surprise, because this is where they hold their largest troves, their largest drawings that were framed by Victor Hugo, grandiose, scenic, dramatic, inky, dreamy, incredibly textured experimental drawings. So this visit turned out to be one of the most extraordinary we did. You can see on the right there one of Victor Hugo's painted frames. There are actually a couple of drawings we ended up borrowing in this image, although you can't really see them very well. I'll just point to them. We borrowed this drawing and this drawing. Maybe there's another slide where you can see them better. No, I'll just go back. So in very difficult conditions, because the light is terrible, and also it was freezing, no heating, freezing. So we're all bundled up looking at these drawings and trying to use our flashlight on our phones to see them better. And in very little time, Cindy and I really had to look at these works very carefully and decide which ones we would have liked. We traveled to Dijon and also borrowed from the National Museum in Dijon, so a number of works there. This is us again in another makeshift study room. As you can see, the study rooms range in types. This actually, the museum was closed for renovation, and we had to travel to the outskirts of Dijon in this sort of makeshift building where they had a temporary storage. This is us in Geneva. We visited a private collection, 2 or 3 private collections in Geneva. This also makes me smile, because we traveled to Munich and we saw a private collection in Munich where they also refused to let us, they asked us not to photograph, and we generally don't take photographs in private collections, so I don't have any photographs of that visit, I'm afraid. But so Cindy and I decided to just show you our beer garden visits in Munich. Luckily, these trips are sort of touched with moments of just stepping outside our research and seeing other museums, going to traditional restaurants, local theatres. So as we're doing research on our own show, we're actually taking in the flavours of the country and discovering other works. And I should say that in my own experience, a lot of my other exhibitions were born out of these types of travels. So you'll be working on one exhibition, but then you'll discover something that'll just put a little sort of twinkle in your mind, and it'll evolve into a whole other exhibition. So travels lead to travels and journeys lead to journeys. This is us in Stockholm. We had a wonderful visit to Stockholm and the study room in Stockholm. Guernsey and Jersey. So this brings me back a moment to Victor Hugo's life, and Victor Hugo was banished from France. He was very politically active, and he, after the coup d'etat of Louis-Napoleon Bonaparte in 1851, he was banished and fled to Brussels. And not even a year after his exile in Brussels, he had written a satire on Bonaparte and ended up being evicted from Brussels too. So where next? Well, not too far, in fact. He chose the islands, the Channel Islands that sit between France and England. And as you can see, they're actually closer to France than to England. This is Normandy and Brittany here. And he moved first to Jersey, the island of Jersey. Although they're under British jurisdiction, he could actually see France from the island, which was key. And there were a number of other exiles there, so he was part of a community, although his ego was such that he never completely associated. In fact, he didn't want to go to London because he would have been associated with a larger group of exiles there. He wanted to be his own independent figure. And somewhat in these islands, he could be, I'm sure there was something close to becoming sort of the leader or a sort of local king of the island. It was these were places where he could reign in his own way. But lo and behold, he got into trouble in Jersey as well, and a few years later had to leave there. And where to go next? Well, he just popped over to Guernsey, the island next door. In Guernsey, Victor Hugo ended up buying a house. The law in Guernsey was such that if you owned property, you couldn't be evicted. So that was that. And with the proceeds of the sale of Les Contemplations, a book of poems, Victor bought this wonderful home called OTW House. Strategically, this house had a view onto the port of Guernsey, so he could see over everything that was happening in terms of movements coming into the island and receding and leaving the island, but also in the very distance on a clear day he could also see France from here. But he embarked on one of the most extraordinary domestic renovations that I've ever seen. The house is open to the public. I flew, unfortunately Cindy wasn't with me on this trip, but I flew to Guernsey to spend some time in the house. And I should say that this home went experiencing this house went hand in hand with all of my research on his works on paper. In the same way he experimented and created these wild drawings, he embarked on an extraordinary, creative and original restoration of the house. And when I say created, I mean personally created. He sculpted, painted, wove, cut and pasted. Although he was in exile on this remote island, he stayed very much connected to the world. And he, not only through journals, he had visits from exiles from Paris, from other writers, and he quite clearly had a great connection with antique dealers, because what happened is that he would buy works and then reinvent them and reinvent the furniture, recraft them so that they were tailor-made for this house. And I should also say that some of the greatest texts by Hugo were written in exile in this home. This is where he wrote Les Misérables, Toilers of the Sea, the Légende des siècles. And this is where he spent 15 years of his 19 years in exile. So I'd just like to walk you through the house, because it's very resonant in the person. It resonates with the personality that Victor Hugo was. So on the ground floor, the room of tapestries. These were the sort of dining areas as you went into the house. That sort of armoire piece of furniture, wooden piece of furniture on the right, is a collage of different pieces of furniture. And this is a mirror that was in the center of it, here on the left. And on the right is the slides seem to be going ahead on their own. But on the right is a sculpture of a saint looking up. And Victor himself incised the bottom of it, saying ad caelum, to the sky. And I was particularly struck by this, because everything in this house encourages you to look beyond, to look to the sky. It is, in every sense, the house of an exile. We're reminded by inscriptions that he was an exile, but we're also in touch with what his main activities were in the house, and looking at the skies was one of them. The presence of mirrors was also very strategic, because as you walk into the house, he very, very clearly wanted you to walk into darkness, very much like his darkest drawings. So the only light was reflected in these mirrors. This is a dark room. I forgot to mention that, well, I did mention actually, but the experimentation and the development of photography was a great part of their lives at the time. So the presence of a dark room was very interesting to me, because it reflected the use of the facility that they had with paper and water, and the development and the sort of experimentation that was happening behind the scenes in this house. I mentioned the flicker and the play of light in the bottom of the house, in the ground floor of the house. My slides are going ahead of me. And so in the back there, you see one circular window. This one leads to the garden, but the light reflected through them shines onto this extraordinary display of plates and porcelain. And no space was spared. My slides are rushing on their own. Did I touch something? Okay. So no space was spared. The ceilings were covered. The sides were covered. The corridors, again, this is a flash. This is taken with a flash. The billiard room, this was a games room. Yeah, my slides are rushing ahead. I'm sorry, I have no time. Maybe they want me to speed up.
It's just this. I think you may be clicking it twice instead of once. Nobody else is controlling.
Oh, really? Yeah. No, see, it's going on its own.
That's true, I just did.
Well,
Projection booth, can you please make sure that you are not forwarding the slides, because we seem to have lost control here on our clicker. Sorry, go ahead.
well, that's okay, because you got a good glimpse of the house. This is the dining room with Delft tiles that he'd collected. Of course, the great H there could either be interpreted as OTW House, the capital letter on the title of the house, but most probably the pun was on Hugo. And again, very, very original. We're talking about decoration being done in the 1850s. There is a semblance of a V there on the lower left, the tiles into Vs. And all kinds of sometimes useful, sometimes useless objects in the house too, but somewhat always part of his extraordinary vision. Slides are flowing ahead, so I'm just going to let them flow into the various salons. I don't have a screen, I just have a clicker. But
Well, they should turn it off on the computer, wherever the computer is.
Yeah, it's up at the top. On the first floor, as I mentioned, you start in darkness on the ground floor. You're sort of buried and dipped into darkness, and the only light flickers through and shines onto mirrors or on the porcelain plates. But then as you go up, the chiaroscuro intensifies, and you sort of walk towards the light as you go up. Of course, Victor Hugo's bedroom is at the summit of the house, so the leading light is right at the top. But as you move up, there are, on the first floor, the salons where the Hugo family received their guests. This one's known as the Pink Salon, for obvious reasons. The very rich damask silks and furnishings, a mosaic, a type of mosaic sewn and quilted ceiling, extraordinary light fixtures. Again, another scene of the pink room, and everything is very symbolically placed. Nothing is haphazard. Everything has stayed right where Victor Hugo wanted these things. Another glimpse of the pink room.
Sorry to interrupt. If you wanted to take a break for 90 seconds, they can give you a new clicker.
Oh, is it the clicker?
Apparently.
Okay.
It's defective.
Well, I'll just continue. Can you have them bring a...
It'll take you a few minutes.
All right. I'll just let them flow, because that's what they seem to be wanting to do. So Victor Hugo actually built outdoors scenic views from the house so that he could encourage seeing outwards. This is a contemporary map of the house that shows you that he was very, very concise as to what went where. On the second floor is this extraordinary bedroom, which was purely symbolic. No one slept in there. And on the same floor was his library, which he left exactly as it was, because these were the books that he wanted people to know that he was reading in exile. And I'll let it. So once you get to the top of the house, you reach Victor Hugo's bedroom. And it's an interesting place of the house. It's called the Lookout. He built it, he actually added it to the top of the building. These are carved and painted by Victor Hugo himself. He actually signs them on the lower right. What these images don't reflect is the size of his bedroom. It's tiny. It's like a captain of a ship's chamber. But then next to it, you have this completely glorious sunlit conservatory. So he had his own private room where he slept in a little single bed and wrote, but then next to it you had this complete vision that opened up into the open. And from the top of the house are views of the skies, of the sea, of the landscape. Guernsey is a wild and barren island, although also quite lush in places. So he was a hiker. He took many walks. He knew the island inside out. He also developed a garden and spent hours not only designing the house, but the outdoors of the house. These are views onto the other islands, and this is a view. These views that I'm including now are, in relation to the drawings, very important because they show the changings of the skies. And the skies in the drawings are constantly differing, challenging, dramatic. And my visit to Guernsey was so important in understanding what he was doing. He was looking out of these windows and witnessing the storms of the changes of the sea, the tides, the violence of the ocean, and the drama of the weather. Remember that you're off the coast of England here. This is wild and wintry. And I should also say that the drawings, most of them were made in this small room that I showed you before. And what was interesting, continues to be fascinating to me, is that Victor Hugo's drawings are in no way illustrative of his text. They don't represent scenes from his text. They're not illustrations for his novels. They stand apart. They have a wonderful independence. The only thing they have in common with his novels is the fact that he used the same tools. So there was a very easy transition from writing to drawing, paper, pen, and ink. So I find that this exhibition, one of the reasons we felt it was important to exhibit these drawings is because, as important as his novels were, he was shifting into this completely different creative realm. And with the same tools, with the nib of his pen and the plume of his pen, would kind of transition over and create completely different realms of his mind. And he was using his imagination in a completely parallel way in the drawings than from the novels. And yet both were made in that tiny room that I showed you. So at the tip of the house, overlooking these extraordinary landscapes, these works were made. I also walked around the island just to sort of put myself into the shoes of the great Hugo, and found, to my surprise, these wondrous beaches, and looking for pebbles in the same way he did. But I thought I'd share them just because these are really the landscapes that he was experiencing at the time he was making those works. So now just a few words we've been on these incredible journeys, we've taken our adventures, we've conversed, we've looked, we've seen enormous amounts of work, we've discussed, we've read, we've done our research. What happens next? So back to the drawing board. We are in LA, we're at the Hammer, and we decide to just put everything we've done, every evidence of what we've done, on a large table. And this is when we start to imagine we start to think about what is it that comes up when we look at everything on a big table. What are the aspects of our research and of our story that really come to the forth? And so at that point, we felt that the themes and the great opposing forces of stones and stains came to life. And that's where our title came from, that's where our theme comes from. And with that thinking process came the themes that are exhibited in here at the Hammer at the moment. Stones, then water, as I was saying before, spheres, his observations of the skies, justice, as I mentioned before. Hugo was a great defender of human rights and a believer in social justice. And finally, the more abstract and most ethereal works, stains, pure experiments of water and ink on paper. The next phase is the working of the exhibition catalogue, which is almost like organizing a whole other exhibition. What happens in the catalogue has its own life. It's almost like an exhibition within a book. You're sort of thinking in a parallel way when you design and conceive the book. So we spent some time designing. We work with a fantastic designer in New York called Miko Magenti, and collaborated with her. We were very involved in every aspect, so in the designs of the book. Color correcting was primary in this exhibition because we found that all the negatives and all the photographs we were getting were very, very badly colored. And this is just to prove to you. The photograph on the left was provided to us by the Bibliothèque Nationale, and the photograph on the right is actually much closer to the original and is the new photograph that we altered after we'd had done our own color verifications. And we actually sent our designer to Paris to color correct all the works. So this is, for curators of works on paper, it's particularly important to get the color right. This is the one chance you get to illustrate these drawings. With paintings, it's less tricky, but with drawings, because paper is the same as the paper of the book, it's fundamental to get the color correcting right. So we went to great extent to do this. Again, the image on the left was the photo that was provided to us. The image on the right is what we finally came up with after color correcting and what we chose for the catalogue. These are the end papers that we chose for the catalogue, and this is a lot of fun because this is where the sort of this is where our own magic happens when we decide to design. And then the essays. In this particular book, Florian, our colleague, opens the book with a sort of elucidation on the theme of the show, From Stones to Stains. Cindy decided to explore Hugo's drawings in print, and I became quite fascinated by his visions of the night and cosmic landscapes and his drawings of the moon and planets. And actually this exhibition and this book is the first time that this aspect of Hugo's drawings have ever been explored. So this is completely new research, and we found some new documents. So this was an exciting aspect. And then my colleague Mathieu did a very detailed chronology, which in Hugo's case is very important because there's so much else happening politically in France at the time, and we also wanted to make sure that his writing was represented. We worked with exhibition designers, Johnson Markley, who I've known for a long time and worked with at the Menil, and this is also a fun part. We went through many different iterations of design. This is one of them with white walls, which we felt didn't work at all. This was one with yellow walls, which definitely didn't work. This comes closer to what we decided in the end, but we felt the drawings needed to be somewhat enclosed and framed because the ceilings of that gallery are very, very high. We worked a lot with the model. So a lot of the thinking process happens with a model, where you're like children with a doll's house, sort of shifting things around. And this is by the way, this is not the actual exhibition. This is an image of the rendition done by our designers, which looks very much like the exhibition. This is what we came up with in the end, and which we were happy with. And then to the moment that happened less than 2 weeks ago, after over 5 years of preparation. So we come to the very end. The galleries need to be built and constructed. All the signage needs to be designed. exceptionally for this exhibition, and I've never done this before, but I think I'll revert to doing this at every exhibition in the future. What happens when you organize an exhibition is, especially for loan shows like this, is that you have very little time when the works arrive to decide where they're going to go. So you have to be very quick and on the mark. When the works arrive, you're surrounded by your preps, your registrars, and the lenders. So people have come from France, from the Met, from Chicago, and it has to happen very quickly. And then once it's up, it's up. You can't move it, because then the lender will leave, and for legal reasons, you won't be able to move it. So Cindy and I were worried that we wouldn't have enough time, and we also had to have our plan ready-made by the time the lenders arrived. So we decided to come in over the weekend when the galleries were closed but ready, and some poor prep assistant had to make facsimiles for us of every single work. Same size, same everything, but fake. So we actually hung the show with facsimiles over the weekend. And we were so grateful to have been able to do this, because we have no idea how we would have been able to hang this exhibition so quickly if we hadn't. So here we are over the weekend hanging facsimiles and making sure everything was where we wanted it to be, with blue tape literally on the walls. This is the first day of installation. On the left is Haley, our registrar, patiently waiting for couriers to come in. Facsimile in the case as well. All the cases have to be alarmed, so that's a whole other complication. This is what the works look like when they arrive. This is a crate from the Maison Victor Hugo, I believe. Works arrived, taped up, protected. The first phase is condition reporting. So every work has to be looked at very carefully to see if it's actually been altered in the transport between, in this case, Paris and here. This is us again. This is the courier from the Bibliothèque Nationale. So every single work has to go through this rigorous examination when they arrive. Lots of commotion happening in the galleries at this point. So all the works laid out flat. This is Haley taking pictures of them as they arrive, removal from the crates. Once that's done, installation starts. So here you see half facsimiles, half originals. We're sort of working as the works come out, hanging them up. And the pressure is on at this point. This is one of the largest works in the exhibition being hung. You have a few moments to look at the work and to sort of either eyeball it or calculate where you want. And so our poor colleagues have to hold them up in a way that they're not obstructing the view. It's not always easy, especially with the largest works. Placement of the stones right at the end. And I'll just end with the final image of the actual show. So this is what I was mentioning when I started, the fait accompli. And I'll bring this to a close here, because I hope that these journeys, these adventures, and the various activities that happened in the 5 years prior will encourage you to see the exhibition perhaps in a different light. But the finished product is only meters away. So I encourage you all to go and spend some time and to see the real things now. And thank you very much again. And I'll take some, if there are any questions, I will take some. Yes. Would you wait for the microphone, if you don't mind?
Who pays for all of this?
Very good question. What I didn't illustrate in my talk is all the fundraising we need to do. Who pays for it? Well, the museum fundraisers. And so we have a wonderful group of supporters who are credited at the entrance of the exhibition. I believe two of our principal supporters are in the room, Alice and Nahum Leiner. Thank you very much for supporting this exhibition. Alice and Nahum have been supporting my exhibitions for many years, and I'm eternally and incredibly grateful to you both. So yes, lots of fundraising to do behind the scenes as well.
I'm sorry, I should have asked one other piece of this question, which is how much does the exhibit cost altogether? When you count your trips to Europe and, you know, all and yes, how much does it cost altogether when
Well,
you count,
you know, it's
count
done.
the whole business, your trips to Europe, the research, the bringing the paintings over or the drawings over, and so on.
Yeah, it's divided up into various budgets. So I can't give you a lump sum, but there's a travel budget, there's a budget for the catalogue, there's a budget for the loans. The largest chunk of money for an exhibition like this goes towards the loans because it's insurance reasons, crates, the building of crates, the flying of the couriers. And an exhibition like this can cost anywhere between $200,000 to $500,000. But we don't have a lump sum because it's really divided over the years in various budgets. The catalogue is a huge expense as well. That's a different budget.
Allegra, I'm learning so
Hi.
much about Victor Hugo, thanks to your exhibition and thanks to what you shared with us.
Thank you.
This 20 years that he spent in emigration, yes, in exile, have he written any of his novel during this time, or he devoted himself mostly to this incredible creative visual aspect of his career?
He wrote many of his works, some of his most important works, in exile. He wrote Les Misérables, Les Contemplations, The Toilers of the Sea, La Légende des Siècles, many articles. He remained, as I said, very active politically, so he wrote numerous reports and was writing the whole time. In fact, I would argue that he may not have written as much if he hadn't been in exile.
So the exile was good for his creativity?
I would say so, yes. It really fired up the mind.
Wonderful exhibition and so enlightening on him. I was shocked to see how much color was in his home on Guernsey. And were you shocked as well, the dichotomy of the work being so monochromatic? Were there works that delved into color, or?
You know, that's a very, very good point. Thank you for that. There's little color in his drawings. Perhaps similarly to when you read Les Misérables, there's little color in that too. It's very much about grays and somber hues, the hues of poverty, so to speak. The drawings reflect the drama of the landscapes and the drama of biomorphic forms. I think there are a number of reasons for that. One of them, it is a reflection of his personality. It's this sort of fiery personality. But it's also access. You know, as I said, he had direct access to pen and ink, and those were the tools and mediums that he was using. But I think he had a great visual sense and a great sense of aesthetics, and he expressed that wherever he could. And in his house, he had the time and the possibility, because at that point he was receiving the dues from the sales of his books. So he was actually a wealthy, successful, popular figure. And he invested in great tapestries and rich silks. And what I did notice, as I said before, is that you start somber. You know, the blacks and the whites are very much on the ground floor. And as you lift up in the house, the colors and the lights start to glisten. And so I think there's a sort of symbolic effect, there's a sort of theatrical choreography within that. And the colors are also very strategically chosen. So the most colored area of the house is the first floor where he received guests. But then as you go up to this sort of symbolic room, which is also called sort of the room of death, it was not a habitable room, the one on the second floor. He called it the bed of Garibaldi. He was a great fan and admirer of the Italian nationalist Garibaldi, and he invited him, I believe, to come to Guernsey when he was in London. Garibaldi and Victor Hugo actually never met, but he had this sort of symbolic room there. And that room goes back to being more somber, and it's all wooden. And then you reach the top and you have both. You have a very dark bedroom, but a very light lookout and belvedere. So light and dark constantly competing, both in the drawings, in his novels, and in the physicality of his domestic setting. But there is a little bit of color in the drawings. There's some blue, and the frames are colored. He obviously had access to blue ink, and there are tinges of blue, perhaps also because of the reflection of the water and the sea. But apart from that, very restrained use of tones and colors, yes.
Thank you for a great presentation, especially since you're missing your partner on this. I'm always fascinated by how things come to be. And, you know, Victor's life is obviously something that's now affected your journey. So I also find these connections in time very interesting to watch and see how people change because of what they do based on what somebody else did. But I sort of have a practical question. When you were in these, looking at the works firsthand out on the viewing tables, you know, I noticed that, you know, your partners and all were like 5 inches away kind of studying these things. And things happen, right? I mean, hairs fall from your face. You know, a little bit of spittle might come out of your mouth and you're excited by something. And maybe this is like a water-soluble ink or something. And I mean, who's actually watching to make sure that you didn't alter what was well, there weren't these little bubble marks on this before. Oh, we don't know anything about that. You know, so I mean, how is that controlled? And is there any concern about forgeries? I know in the high art world, there's a tremendous amount of forgery out there, and many museums don't even like to admit it. But I mean, the careful checking of when you receive something, is it as it was sent? I mean, how does all that happen, and how do you make sure that you have what they sent?
Yeah. 2 good questions. First of all, you're right. You have to be so diligent and so careful in viewing works, and these study rooms are not always open to everyone. Cynthia and I happen to be seasoned curators, I would say. We know what we're doing. We've worked with works on paper for many years, and there is a technique of viewing works in a study room. You're not allowed any pens, only pencils. No mechanical pencils, only, you know, normal pencils. And you're often asked to wear gloves, and when not, you're asked to go and wash your hands. All the drawings are matted, so you're not actually ever touching the drawing. You're actually handling a mat that holds the drawing. And you learn through the years of expertise of working with these types of works of art not to talk while you're looking at a drawing, and not to come too close to it with your camera because it may fall, and to look at it in a certain way when you're using a lens or a loupe. These are all part of the training of a drawings and prints curator. So you come, as I said, well seasoned and well prepared, and often you're only allowed in these study rooms if you have that experience. And if you don't have that experience, at the Grunwald here, for instance, we encourage our students from UCLA to come in and to see our works that are stored in exactly the same types of boxes and presented in exactly the same way, but we teach them how to do it. And the wonderful thing for our students is that access to get away from the galleries into a private, intimate, secluded space and to look at prints by Rembrandt and Dürer and to handle them, to have that direct communication and conversation with the artist through a work on paper. So it's really about training and practice and that. To answer your second question, you're absolutely right. There are fakes out there. In fact, the Metropolitan Museum, actually, we were looking at a drawing at the Met, and in our discussions with Pierre Georgel, who's the Victor Hugo expert, discovered that one of the drawings we were looking at is in fact a fake. So the research that you do in these exhibitions is fundamental. I mean, you have to speak to people who know more than yourself. You have to look with a incisive eye. You have to look at the fakes in order that you might be able to decipher one or understand one if you see it again. And provenance is very important. So we look at provenance and who owned the drawings before. So obviously most of the drawings we've borrowed from the Bibliothèque Nationale and the Maison Victor Hugo come straight from the artist, straight from the man who made them. Other drawings that have been on the market many years, you have to be very, very careful. And the past 5 years has seen, I think, a drawing by Victor Hugo made almost $1 million a few years ago. It's actually in the exhibition. So the market has become very rarefied, and the drawings have become extraordinarily valuable. So you have to be extra diligent when selecting them for an exhibition. I don't know if you mentioned how do you know you're getting the real thing when it comes here? Well, once you've seen it in these places, that's when you make the decision. You don't have it come here. Once it's coming, it's the one that you've seen. It's very unlikely that you'll get something else on the way. But there are forgeries out there, and you have to be diligent. Gail.
So did he do most of his drawings when he was in exile?
He did, I would say, a large part of his drawings while he was in exile. Now, I don't know if that's because most of the drawings we know of happen to be those that he made in exile, and perhaps the other ones were easier to have drifted apart. He was traveling, he may have lost them. But you remember that he was 20 years in exile, so that's a large part of his life. I think what happened is when he got to these islands, he had the freedom and the spirit to let his mind loose on paper. So again, very much similar to the writing and the novels, I believe that the exile sort of spurred this surge of creativity, and therefore I would say that many, more than half, were made in exile, yes. And he would draw, he was very resourceful, and paper was expensive and hard to find at times, and so he would draw on envelopes, invitations. Sometimes you can really track his daily life through the drawings because they're applied to correspondence or a musical performance invitation. And so everything he could find that he could make a drawing on, he would use. He was very resourceful that way.
Hi. Will you have a separate discussion or conversation about your research findings into his astrological themes, or should we just buy the book?
I haven't planned to do a lecture on it, but the essay in the book is very explicit, and I encourage you to read it, if not to buy it. You know, the book is as often happens with exhibition. First of all, I love the books because they are what stays. You know, the exhibition comes down, but the book stays. But the book is also a place where you can do things that you can't do in the exhibition. And so I became fascinated by astronomy through this research, and so I delved into a field that I didn't know. I'm now organizing an exhibition on the moon, as very much in parallel to this, and so I always feel that the book is not only a great companion, but is a great addition to the exhibition. And you know, when I talked about the installation of the exhibition, I didn't say that one of the reasons why I became a curator, and one of the great fascinations of being a curator, is the moment when the works come to the wall. That's when the magic happens. That's when you start to see things that you haven't seen before in these works. They start to have a dialogue, they start to converse. And things that you felt work very well together don't end up working very well together, so you shift them. And that's one form of magic that happens when you're installing the exhibition. And I think the parallel form of magic, for me, happens when you're making the book. They're sort of two different aspects of telling a story. One is on the walls of a gallery, and one is within the end papers of your book. And so I always encourage. You know, we're getting so far from handling the object of the book because we do everything online, and now there are catalogs online. But that will never take away the great satisfaction of turning the pages of a book and reading on from the exhibition, reading on from that.
Could you speak to his influence on visual artists of his contemporaries and currently? Because I saw, you know, Picasso on a piece of his, and I can definitely see his influence in many works of art, and especially on paper. Yeah.
Interestingly, Victor Hugo never exhibited his drawings. They were a private endeavor. They were sort of behind the scenes. He was public about his writing and determined about his writing, but the drawings were reserved for friends. They were sent to friends, for his family. He sent many to his daughters. They were sort of within this restricted realm. So he actually, to return to the book, Cindy, my colleague, explores his relationship to printmaking, because of course printmaking was a way to disseminate these drawings, but he wasn't interested in it because they didn't quite reflect the freshness and the sort of directness of his drawings. So this meant that very few artists actually had access to the work, but this doesn't mean that they didn't know about them. his contemporaries, some of them, through printmakers, through friends, did have some access to them. I mean, Baudelaire knew the drawings. Years later, Van Gogh talks about his drawings. So they trickled out in ways. I believe that Odilon Redon must have seen his drawings, for instance. But there's no direct evidence of this, and they were never shown in the salons in Paris. So I would argue that he didn't have a direct influence on his contemporary artists, apart from the printmakers and other artists that he had direct access to for publishing. But it didn't take long for artists to be influenced and impacted by the work. And the first surge of impact comes in the 1930s with the Surrealists. So one of the grandsons of Victor Hugo, Jean Hugo, was a Surrealist. He was married to Valentine Hugo, who was a great figure and presence within André Breton's circle. And through Valentine and Jean, a lot of these artists received gifts of the drawings. Picasso received 3 or 4 drawings by Victor Hugo, one of which is in the exhibition. That was a gift by Valentine Hugo. André Breton owned 2 extraordinary abstract drawings, also one of them with a moon, that are now in the Pompidou with the Breton archive. I'm convinced that Max Ernst would have seen his drawings. Hugo used a technique which Cindy and I have yet to decipher, but it resembles décalcomanie, which is a technique of bleeding drawings that the Surrealists used. But the Surrealists were they were particularly interested in Hugo's form of what they would have defined as automatic drawing, which is a drawing that makes itself. You relinquish the hand and you allow the pool of water to go where it wants to go. And they were interested in examining the mind without the influence of the hand. And Hugo did that in many of his more abstract drawings that we call taches, stains. So he would sort of manipulate the paper and let the ink flow where it wants to go. And this is done in the 1850s as opposed to the 1930s and 40s. So I'm not saying that Victor Hugo invented abstract art, no way, but he certainly was doing things that are then become more, I would say, mainstream in the following century. So the Surrealists, and then from then on his drawings became a little bit more accessible through the Maison, the exhibitions at the Maison. And one of the reasons we feel that this exhibition had to happen at the Hammer, and by the way, the loans were so difficult to get that this is the only venue. We're not allowed to send this exhibition anywhere else. But one of the reasons we felt strongly that it should be here is because we want our community of artists to, we think that our community of artists here will respond very strongly to these works. And so it's very much an exhibition for that community. And who knows what impact it'll have. We'll see. Yes.
From a technical point of view, could you reflect upon the type of inks that he may have preferred or how he obtained them and the type of papers he may have preferred if he had the opportunity to do so?
Yeah, he used, above all, a very an ink that we call iron gall ink, which is a sort of dark brown, black ink. Unfortunately, it's an ink that over the years burns the paper. So that's hence the fragility of these works. But he also used, any inks that he could find and that he wrote with. And actually, Cindy and I have organized Scholars' Day, especially to study the techniques, because to this day we don't know. There have been claims, unproven claims that he used coffee and blood and earth and sand, and we haven't endorse those claims because there's no proof. But what we would like to do with this exhibition is to understand exactly how he achieved these reticulated effects of ink on paper. We still don't know how he did that. So we've invited the paper conservator of the Louvre to come here on a Scholars' Day, and together with other works on paper experts, curators and conservators, and we're going to have a sort of round table on a closed day, and in which we really study them close up and try to understand exactly what inks he was using and how he was achieving these extraordinary effects. I think that the fact that there were photographs being developed there at the same time, and that he had access to these negatives and positives, had a great impact on his draftsmanship. But the truth is that to this day we don't know exactly what techniques he was using, but we do know that about some of the inks. We know that he used both the nib and the plume of his pen. We know that he scratched the papers. We know that he used his fingerprints. He cut the papers. He used stencils. He printed. He made. He manipulated the paper in extraordinary ways. And as far as the type of paper, again, as I said before, it's whatever was accessible. It tends to be pretty straightforward. He wasn't using great quality drawing paper necessarily. It was often just whatever he found. But there's a great variety. Maybe he happened to be, traveling with a wonderful sketchbook, and so he's using the good paper in the sketchbook. But if he's drawing at his desk and he has an odd invitation there, he'll use that. So there's great variety and no straight answer. I'm going to take the last few questions. I'm sure there are people who want to leave on this.
Did he ever use pencil or charcoal for drawing?
Yes, he used charcoal a lot, and he used pencil as well. Yes, and charcoal. Charcoal is very crumbly and smoky, and so it adapts very well to his imagery. You can crumble it over the sheet, and you can sort of smoothen your hand over it, and it'll create a very smoky effect. It's less, it's more versatile than graphite. So. Yeah, he's not. He's into the more painterly sort of expressionist effects. And that's why the plume is really, and the brush is adapts very well to his technique.
Allegra, you mentioned that it's impossible to organize traveling for this exhibition, but in my understanding, the rules in most of the museums that once work on paper exposed to any light, even kind of restricted light, it has to go after 1 month, after 2 months, it has to go for 2 years in a dark storage.
Yes.
So it's not that you didn't get permission, it's almost like impossible to put this fragile material for traveling. But the question I have for you, you mentioned that the first time in the United States exhibition of Victor Hugo drawings was taking place in New York at the Drawing Institute. But when was his first ever exhibition was done in Europe, in France?
In France, in Paul Meurice, his executor, who created the Maison Victor Hugo, I believe held his first exhibition in 1903. I may be mistaken, but it's around then was his first exhibition. And actually there is a little catalogue of it. It wasn't held at the Maison, it was held in a gallery in Paris. And there's very little knowledge onto who visited that exhibition. There's very little knowledge on what was exhibited because the catalogue has very vague titles. So we assumed that the works were the works that Paul Maurice owned and that are now in the Maison Victor Hugo, but we don't know for sure. But in the early 20th century, yeah. So at that, I will release you to your sunny Sunday afternoon. Thank you.